Debbie has been on the run for a new job for a while now. She has been staying up from dusk till dawn on her PC, surfing the internet to get first-hand information about any vacancy. Things, no doubt, have been tough for Debbie ever since she lost her loving husband. Debbie's late husband was a military man. He was in the U.S. Army for years. He slightly lost his life in war after his daughter was born. Debbie became a widow and a single mother simultaneously. Her family was the only one she could fall upon, but unfortunately they neglected her after the death of her husband. According to them, they weren't ready to help because they had warned Debbie before the husband's death not to get married to him because of his profession. They didn't want Debbie to get married to a soldier because, in their opinion, soldiers are liable to die young. So, for this reason, they all deserted Debbie for being disobedient and following her wish only. Debbie had to cater to herself and her new baby girl. In this quest, she enrolled in 2 part-time jobs. She did one from dusk till noon and resumed the other from afternoon till dusk. That was the work pattern for Debbie for years. That was how she could provide the basic things her kid needed. She was a great mother. Regardless of her tight schedule, she ensured to provide time for her baby girl, Victoria. She dropped her off in the morning and picked her up in the evening. They lived in a mini apartment, and she had a smooth relationship with her immediate neighbors. When Victoria clocked 3, Debbie thought it was wise to enroll her in a nursery school. While she had the bump of Victoria and her husband was still alive, they often talked about how they would raise their kids. Debbie's husband assured her that his kids would get the best treatment any parent would offer, starting from their introductory level to adulthood, irrespective of what it would cost him. And even after her husband's death, Debbie promised to fulfill his promises as that was the least she could do in his respect. After all, that was what he wanted for his kid. Debbie enrolled baby Victoria in the best school in the city. Although expensive, she was ready to bet on it with her life savings. It wasn't too difficult to keep up with it at first, since she had planned well and saved for a day. However, she could only go for a short while. Her savings got exhausted within 2 terms. She was living a big man lifestyle for her kid. She thought of calling it to quit at some point, but her husband's purpose wouldn't let her. She decided that instead of giving her daughter a low-standard education, it would be better to increase her income to balance the high standards she envisaged for Victoria. Fortunately, Debbie was able to secure a job with a big firm. It was more like a contract that was to last for 2 years. It was a big one for her and a breakthrough that came at the best time. To top it all off, she was allowed to work from home. This allowed her to spend more time with her baby girl after school hours than before. Her job wasn't a hectic or tasking one. She was the firm's auditor, and she did her work diligently. Most of their meetings and conferences took place on Zoom. This went on till Victoria was 5. She was done with nursery and set for pre-high school education, which would cost much more tuition fees. Debbie's contract had just expired as it was 2 years already. Unfortunately, the firm was not ready to retain her. This had nothing to do with incompetence or unsatisfied service, but strictly the organization's rules. They hire auditors who come highly recommended every 2 years. They preferred to shuffle auditors because of 2 reasons. Their excuses were that they didn't want anyone feeling entitled to their company, a significant reason why they made their auditors work from home. Secondly, they understand the post is big and pays handsomely with just little work. They didn't want a single person to enjoy the benefits of that. Hence, they instead shuffle among certified auditors. The reasons seemed lame to Debbie, but there was nothing she could do about it. They owned their company after all, and were free to do what they deemed best. Before the contract expired, Debbie was able to buy a car with the hope of paying up installments, since she had other things to sort. She was to pay on an agreed date until she could complete the payment and gain full car ownership. Meanwhile, failure to pay the money for each month in 3 consecutive months would result in losing the vehicle. She was back to job hunting. She was back in the labor market. She spoke with a friend who told her about a conceded vacancy at a profound company in town after months of intense job searching. The interview was restricted to recommendations. You won't secure a job with the company if you do not come highly recommended. The company only interviewed prospects and potential employees on weekends, Saturday to be precise. That was weird too, but all of that didn't matter. All she hoped for was to get a job to meet up with her outstanding bills. She had to go with Victoria because it was a weekend, and she didn't want to leave her home alone. When she got to the company, she met up with the interviewer. He looked well-suited and composed. He didn't bother questioning her about her personal life or why she had decided to bring her daughter to her interview. He asked professional questions only. Debbie ensured to give the best response to every statement. She was careful with her words, and she didn't want to be flawed to avoid excuses from the interview for not hiring her. The interviewer asked her why she thought she deserved the position. She went further to explain how she had been able to work with the big firm for 2 years with no negative remarks. The curious interviewer asked her, "If you were as good as you claimed, what was your name again?" "Miss Debbie, sir," she quickly chipped in. "Yes, Miss Debbie, if you were as good as you claimed, why did the previous organization you worked with sack you?" She smiled and managed to explain the nature of the work as it was based on a contract after a brief detailed explanation. The interviewer nodded in satisfaction. He looked impressed. However, he told Debbie he wished he could help, but the position vacant was not for an auditor, which was Debbie's specialization, and he was sorry that the company would not be able to employ her. Debbie tried convincing him to change his mind. She explained how desperate she needed the job. She pointed at Victoria, sitting innocently playing with toys. She promised to take some personal and virtual classes and even seminars to understand what she needed to do. She assumed she was going to work twice as much as she worked for her previous company. The interviewer told her he understood how Debbie felt more than Debbie had pointed out. He told her that his boss, the company's owner, had given them a stern warning not to hire or employ an amateur in a critical position. He said that he would try as much as possible to help Debbie by linking her up with his aunt, who owned a company that needed an auditor, and hopefully she would get the job. He told Debbie to drop her contact, and should there be a development, after informing his aunt if she agrees to fix up an appointment, he will put a call through to Debbie. Debbie thanked him for being thoughtful to help, for his compassion, even though he didn't know her from Adam. She called out to Victoria as they made their way out of the interviewer's office. The interviewer waved at Victoria, and she waved back with a bright smile. "What a beautiful kid," the interviewer commented. As they left, they approached where Debbie had parked her car. Surprisingly, she saw a young man trying to lock her car tires. She anxiously questioned the young man's act. The man ignored her questions and instead replied to her with another question. "Aren't you Miss Debbie Pax?" Debbie's eyebrows raised a bit after hearing this. "This person must know me," she thought within herself as she managed to answer the question. The man introduced himself as a worker from the company where Debbie got her car with the agreement to pay on installment. He claimed that he had been directed to forelock the car, as Debbie had refused to pay her installment for 3 consecutive months, which was the company's rule that she signed and agreed to. Debbie tried pleading with the young man, but he explained that his hands were tied as he was only deployed for a purpose he had to do. While at that, Victoria sighted a wallet that was some meters away. She tapped her mom to inform her, but Debbie was engrossed in what the young man was doing to his car and didn't concentrate on Victoria. Victoria walked down to where the wallet was lying and picked it up. Miraculously, she found well-stacked cash notes in the wallet. She took it and ran back to her mom to show her what she had just seen. The young man had left. Debbie was shocked at the money Victoria had found in the wallet. She counted it, and it was around $5,000. Victoria asked if that was enough to repossess her car, and she answered yes. Victoria advised that she pay them and get her car back. Debbie, however, lectured that taking someone else's property, regardless of how big or small, shouldn't be taken without the person's consent. She assured me that she would not touch the money but return to the company she had just left. Turning back, She found a small piece of paper in the wallet conveying the address and phone number of the wallet's owner. She concluded to call the number and afterward locate the address. She spoke with the man who directed her to the address in the wallet. Debbie headed to the place with Victoria. On getting there, they met a man who seemed to be in his middle 40s. Debbie asked if he was the one he was talking to over the phone, and he confirmed it. While Debbie was about to explain how her young girl came across the wallet, the man cut her short, introducing himself to her. In his words, he said, "My name is Dan Rock. I am the CEO of the popular The Rock Group of companies." Debbie was wowed. She had always heard about the brand, but never knew what the CEO looked like. At this point, her attention had grown and her curiosity to 100%. Dan Rock continued, "Every year, I do a social experiment, and this is what I do. I dropped my wallet, stacked up with cash in my wallet with an address to reach when eventually found. I have been doing this for the past 15 years, and I'm glad to tell you that you are the first person to call me." At this moment, Debbie was lost for words. All that came out of her mouth were repeated wows as she tried to comprehend the revelation. Dan Rock told Debbie that she had made him believe that there are still great and honest people on Earth. He said to her that the money in the wallet belonged to her, and that wasn't all. He told her the house they were in, which he added in the address in the wallet, was one of his houses, and if Debbie loved it, the house would become hers henceforth. Debbie couldn't believe her ears. She thought it was all a prank and cautioned Dan Rock to stop pulling her leg. But Dan Rock couldn't be more serious, as he told her he was serious. Victoria jumped and hugged Dan Rock as she appreciated him and told him they loved the house. Debbie was teary at this point, and she thanked Dan Rock continuously, as she still found it hard to comprehend what had just happened. Dan Rock instead expressed his gratitude to Debbie for being honest and not being like the rest. He left afterward. While Debbie and Victoria were still thanking God for the marvelous thing he had just done, a strange call came in. It was the interviewer. He called to inform Debbie that he had spoken with his aunt and she would love to meet her. They fixed an appointment for the following week. Debbie was able to secure the job. She repossessed her car alongside, and she was able to enroll her daughter in the school of her choice. Indeed, honesty pays more than wages. It is not something we prepare for because you don't know when it will pave the way for you. The best thing is to learn to be honest naturally and not pretend to be honest. Our honesty can also be tested, just like Debbie's case. The wallet came when she needed help with her car. What could be more tempting? Many would mistake that for God's blessings. Honesty is a great virtue, and everyone should have it. It has a significant role in changing our world and making it more habitable. The question now is, will you be honest like Debbie? You should. It will help our planet.
The two lovers walked hand in hand towards Don Angie Restaurant, an upscale Italian eatery situated in a sleazy corner of Manhattan, New York. Brian wasn't a fan of Italian food, but Chloe had requested it, and whatever the pretty model wanted, she got. No questions asked. The sliding glass doors separated as they stepped on the threshold. Brian took a sweeping glance around the half-filled room and caught several pairs of eyes staring at them in admiration, particularly Chloe. He used to feel proud each time heads would turn in their direction, whenever they walked along the streets, but that feeling gradually gave way to irritation. However, his girlfriend enjoys every bit of the attention. "That spot over there would be perfect for us," Chloe said, pointing at a round table facing the entrance in the center of the room. "Sure," Brian responded. He would have preferred any of the seats at the edges, but then, whatever Chloe wants, she gets. Their orders were taken, and Brian stared at the pretty blonde sitting opposite him while they waited to be served. Her blue-brown eyes, high cheekbones, nicely set nose, and the most kissable lips he has ever seen. He thought himself lucky to have her as his girlfriend, even though he was equally handsome, 6'2", and athletically built. He loved Chloe so much and would do anything within his power to make her happy. But he wasn't sure he could say the same for her anymore. They've been together for about a year, but his last 3 months have been quite depressing. Chloe would pick at every little thing he did and didn't seem tired of nagging him. They mostly ate in silence. He didn't like how the caramel pasta with pickled cantaloupe tasted in his mouth, and after struggling to push a few forkloads of it down his guts, he gave up, and instead chose to be sipping the beverage that was served alongside it. "You don't seem to like it that much," Chloe said passively as she munched her food with relish. "Not really. They must have been too generous with the quantity," Brian smiled as he tried to make a joke. 15 minutes later, the bill was brought, and Brian's face lost color. He couldn't believe what he saw. $145 for some tasteless food and beverages? "What the hell?" he said under his breath. "Excuse me?" the cashier retorted, raising her eyebrow. "Never mind," he said briefly, and brought forward his credit card. Brian heaved a sigh of relief that Chloe wasn't there with him at that moment, or else he would have come under verbal attack for causing her embarrassment. She had gone to the restroom. Then Chloe signaled him that the Uber she hailed with her app had arrived. Now that was a new one altogether. She didn't tell him about any goddamn Uber. They had come with the metro, and he was expecting they would return with the same mode of transport. More dough down the drain. Chloe sat on the single cushion in her studio apartment and crossed her legs. A cigarette was stuck tepidly in her soft, wet lips. Then she picked up her iPhone 13 Pro Max that had been ringing persistently and peered at the screen through the smoky haze. It was an unknown caller, so she touched the green spot and placed it to her left ear without saying a word. "Hello?" A deep and calm voice wafted through. "Hi," Chloe responded. "I'm Carlos. We met briefly at the sidelines during the expeditions in Las Vegas," he trailed off. "Are you back in New York?" Chloe asked casually, even though her heart was beating rapidly. "Yes. I arrived a couple of days back and would have got in touch immediately if I wasn't so enmeshed with boardroom duties," Carlos said. "That's fine," Chloe replied, the ends of her lips curling into a sensuous smile. Being on the board of a Fortune 500 conglomerate can be pretty demanding. Carlos was only 26, yet he was already filthy rich courtesy of his wealthy dad, who died not long ago, leaving behind a vast inheritance for him and his brother. He was equally good-looking, but average in height. He wouldn't stand a chance in a beauty contest with Brian, but who cares? Not Chloe. He travels worldwide at the snap of a finger, flies in a private jet, and sits atop of vast wealth. Carlos was a dream come true, and she wouldn't let this incredible opportunity slip her fingers. Chloe's attitude towards Brian deteriorated rapidly after she met the money bag. Nothing Brian ever appeals to her anymore. She has been biding her time and looking for a perfect opportunity to slam the door on him, but Brian keeps making things difficult for her. Always patient with her and never seems to get angry, even when she walks all over him on purpose. The same attributes she loves so much about Brian now irritate her. "I don't think I want a wuss bag for a man," she said to herself one day as she lay on her bed, deep in thoughts. Brian is way down the food chain, as if that's not bad enough. He can't do ordinary things like buying expensive gifts or taking her to exclusive restaurants without biting his lips. And to think he owns a deadbeat car? Brian has to face it. He isn't in my league, and if he truly loves me, he shouldn't find it difficult letting me go, she stated quietly, and immediately felt at peace with herself. "We need to talk," she quipped resolutely. Is anything the matter? Brian asked, sensing there was trouble. Yes, this relationship is not working, and we need to go our separate ways, Chloe said. What? Is there anything I did wrong? Brian couldn't believe what he was hearing. We are not a perfect match for each other, Chloe said, and Brian felt the knife go deep into his chest. He wanted to speak, but his mouth was so dry, and he felt a lump in his throat. Doesn't it matter to you that I love you so much? Brian said with a broken heart. It's not about you, and if you love me, you'll let me go, Chloe stated with conviction. There was an awkward moment of silence as they stared at each other, but Chloe looked away and began to fiddle with her phone. Have a nice day, Brian, Chloe said as she walked out of the room and gently closed the door behind her. Brian suddenly felt weak at the knee. He dragged his feet to a chair by the window of his ninth-floor apartment building and sat down. He enjoyed looking down at the cars and people walking along the street whenever he was bored. But today he was also looking down, but wasn't seeing anything. Instead, Chloe's voice keeps reverberating in his mind. He never saw it coming. Even though he had noticed the changes in her some months prior, he had waved it off as a phase that would pass. But he was wrong. As memories of their good times continued to flash through his mind quickly, Brian felt moist in the eyes. Life without Chloe was going to be very tough and depressing. No, he wasn't going to let go of Chloe. He will get back the love of his life no matter what. Chloe was having the best moments of her life. Last night they arrived on Carlos's private jet at Fort Lauderdale Hollywood International Airport, Miami. They lodged in Four Seasons Hotel, rated as one of the city's most exclusive. Today, they were on a yacht speeding along Miami's iconic beach. She completely forgot about Brian and was basking in the euphoria of the moment. Carlos was not just in love with her, but was willing to spoil them with fun and attention. She wore a bikini, a wide straw hat, and dark sunshades. Carlos was scantily dressed too, with only briefs and no shirt. A few meters away was a wine cellar with its temperature maintained by a climate control system. Chloe had never seen such a collection of exotic wines before and decided to go for Leroy Domaine. Caribbean songs wafted through the yacht's sound system. If Chloe were a little sober, maybe she would have noticed the relationship was moving at an unnatural, frenetic pace. But she was too carried away to see. She snapped lots of pictures and videos, and the images wowed her. I love you so much, she said, and kissed him passionately. I love you too, Carlos responded. Brian had searched extensively through Google about how to get an ex-girlfriend back. Most of the recommendations were for him to stay away from her entirely and never check her social media profiles while improving himself for a minimum of 1 month. Sooner than later, he realized how difficult it was to achieve the so-called 3 golden rules. Some days he would feel suicidal, but he struggled to discipline himself to remain steadfast. It has been a month since their separation, and he hasn't done poorly. He was clawing his way up, and the prospect of becoming a rich man was looking bright. It was now time to win back the love of his life. He decided to go through Chloe's Instagram profile, but the images that accosted him almost made him puke. Chloe was living large with another man, and it shocked him how possible it was for someone to experience all that within such a short while. Another shocker hit Brian when he checked the dates the earliest pictures were uploaded and saw it was barely a week after they separated. How could someone be that insensitive? Like an epiphany, reality downed him that Chloe was a gold digger. He had met Don Pablo at a bar where he usually went to drink himself to a stupor at night, but unknown to him, Pablo had been overseeing him, and one day he paid for his drinks before handing him a piece of paper. Brian had forgotten everything about the encounter until a few days later when he came across the piece of paper and saw it was a phone number with a terse text saying, "Call me." "I was pissed off when I saw a promising young man like you wasting away at the bar," Pablo said. He was sitting behind a large table in his grand-looking office. "I want to allow you to turn your sorrows into laughter, but you will have to prove your mettle," Pablo added. Brian could detect a hint of warning in his broad Puerto Rican accent, but was desperate to grasp the opportunity Pablo offered him. The interview, if it can be called that, had snowballed into a fruitful and mutually beneficial partnership. It wasn't long before Brian began to earn upwards of $20,000 cumulatively every other month. He hasn't seen such a staggering amount of money in his entire life, but he knew something wasn't right somewhere, considering he was doing next to nothing except some nocturnal errands. When Pablo began to send him to Mexico through tunnels to receive parcels he suspected to be hard drugs, he escaped and decided to leave New York entirely after surviving a murder attempt. Brian was beginning to enjoy life in Washington. The relatively serene city wasn't anything like New York. It was less noisy, an ideal setting for him to start life on a new slate. Granted, he was able to save a substantial amount of money before running away from Pablo, but he was no longer desperate to get rich. Moreover, he met Cherish soon after he arrived in Washington, and she was the most adorable lady he had ever seen. She was probably not as pretty as Chloe, but her soul's beauty always melts his heart. Talking about Chloe, he heard the money bag dumped her after a couple of months. He was a playboy with a reputation for not staying with any woman for 6 months.
Stacy constantly cursed fate for how long she had to die. It all started with mild ailments, which she did not attach importance to, but then noticed that she was getting weaker. Previously, work had brought her pleasure, but now by the end of the day, she felt completely exhausted and went to bed as soon as she came home. Then Stacy took a vacation and went to rest with her husband. But there she only got worse and had to go to the doctor. So, she learned a disappointing diagnosis, although at first she was still told that it was possible to recover. It would just be long and difficult. Over time, the doctors became increasingly gloomy. She had few relatives by blood, and she was far away, so she began to communicate with her friends less and less, and even her husband distanced himself. She understood it wasn't easy for him either, but that didn't make her any less bitter. The slow decline was painful for her. She would much rather accept a quick death than prolong her days month after month. She began to walk with a cane, slowly, like an old woman. And then the day came when her legs refused. The very next day, her husband Brian began to persuade her to go to the hospital, although the doctor said there was no difference whether she would be there or at home. Stacy wanted to stay at home, and yet she let herself be persuaded. Maybe at least it would be easier for him. But every day it became increasingly unbearable to stay there. And when the doctor said that she had a week or two left, no more, she still asked to go home. Brian stood in the hospital corridor and watched his sick, dying wife being loaded into an ambulance. He looked after her and did not want to believe that such a burden would fall on his shoulders. He stared and stared until the doctor's voice pulled him out of his heavy thoughts. Brian looked at the elderly, cheerful man in a white coat and did not understand the words. The doctor seemed to move his lips without any sound, and Brian unsuccessfully tried to make out what he was saying. The doctor looked sternly at the patient's husband, as if realizing that he did not understand the words he said. "Can you hear me? Good. Look, we did everything we could. Your wife is dying. So let her spend her last days with the man who loves her. Just be with her. She doesn't ask for more. And who knows? Maybe God will have mercy. It's not for nothing that her name is Stacy," the doctor said. He paused for a moment and continued. I would advise you not to hire a nurse, because she has a couple of weeks left at most." The doctor left, and only the smell of medicines remained hanging in the air like a disembodied spirit. Brian looked back towards the ambulance. They were waiting for him. Then everything happened as if in a terrible dream. A man watched as a car drove up to his high-rise building, brought his wife into the apartment, and placed her on the bed. 2 hours had passed since his sick, dying wife had been brought to his apartment. Brian could not come to terms with this. "Brian, my dear, come to me," the wife pleaded hoarsely, but he did not come. "Thank you, my dear, for taking me and sheltering me. I so want to die next to you in our apartment, where we were happy." She coughed heavily with some deep, gurgling sound. He covered his ears with his palms and plopped down on the chair with force, and it creaked loudly. He wanted to respond, but he couldn't. Brian spread out the sofa and went to bed, hoping that his wife would not survive the stress of the trip and would die by morning. But his hopes were not destined to come true. Brian woke up an hour before the alarm clock, and he made himself a coffee and went into the bedroom. His wife was sleeping, still breathing. For some reason, this fact angered him so much that he barely restrained himself from screaming. He was shaking all over with anger. Brian stormed into the kitchen and threw the mug against the wall with all his might. The brown liquid flowed in a large stain over the floor tile, on which not a single scratch was found. He exhaled heavily and began to cry. He was sitting on a chair, and tears of impotence and hopelessness were quietly flowing from his eyes. It was so good when she was finally admitted to the hospital. He could start a new life. He was so deeply immersed in his own thoughts that he shook with indignation and anger. He quickly caught himself when the doorbell rang and hurried to the door and opened it. "What took you so long?" A young beauty was standing there impatiently, holding 2 large glasses of to-go coffee in her hands. "Hush! They brought mine back," Brian quickly said in a whisper. He looked around anxiously, although he understood that his wife would not be able to get up on her own. He stared at the young mistress, who shrugged her shoulders and entered the apartment as if nothing had happened. She took root here during the time that Brian's wife was in the hospital. The girl went into the kitchen. Brian was so angry. "What are you doing?" "You said she was very sick, that she was dying, so she wouldn't get up. Come here, I've missed you," the girl, whose name was Jody, said quickly in a loud whisper, snuggling up to the man. She kissed him with such fervor that he could not resist. When they finished, he had to go to his wife's bedroom, sending the girl to the shower to continue there with her. The husband brought his wife a glass of water, gave her pills, and went into the shower, continuing to have fun. That's where they came up with a plan to get rid of his wife. He was looking forward to being alone with this beauty soon and being able to do whatever he wanted again. After all, his wife would leave him all the wealth, and she was far from poor since she had been working all this time. After her death, he and the new woman will not have to work at all. The girl left, leaving Brian alone with his dying wife. He began to collect her things. Brian packed a full bag and dragged it into the car. Having laid out the back seat in the car, he covered it with a thick blanket and then returned to the apartment and immediately went to his wife. She literally lit up with happiness when she saw him. "My dear, how I missed you. How good it is that you are next to me," the woman said, barely smiling, as she didn't have enough strength for anything else. "Stacy, listen. I have a friend who will help you. If we have no hope for medicine, then we will heal ourselves. I'll take you to a healer now, and he'll help you." Brian lied briefly on the move, trying not to look into her dull, almost colorless eyes. Brian took his wife in his arms and carried her to the car. She weighed almost nothing. Her body seemed to consist of nothing but bones. Brian was disgusted even to hold her in his arms, and nausea came to his throat from the smell of pills that soaked through her skin. He put her in the back seat, covered her with a blanket, and got behind the wheel. He started the car and drove away from the city. They drove for more than 4 hours until they found themselves in a deep forest. He wanted to throw her right in the woods at first, but then he caught sight of an abandoned old house that apparently belonged to a gamekeeper or some local hermit. Brian took his wife in his arms and carried her into the house. He left her on the big bed and left without saying a word. Stacy knew he was leaving her in this old house. She understood that her husband would not come back. He laid her on the bed, and tears of despair and understanding ran from her eyes that she would die of hunger, here, all alone. She looked at him, but Brian averted his eyes. He also understood that everything had become clear to her. Brian left, started his car, and disappeared into the distance. Stacy was lying on a huge bed and crying, unable to turn around or get up. Her mouth soon dried up, and her whole body began to ache, and she really needed to use the bathroom, but no one else would help her. Stacy fell into oblivion, then woke up again, but at some point, she realized that she was not alone in the house. "Here, have a drink. It will make you feel better," said a man whose face was blurring before her eyes. Stacy took a few sips but couldn't go any further. Then the man lifted her head with a big hand and helped her finish the drink. She fell asleep again. Stacy woke up much later, and that's when she saw that some man with a beard was watching her. He came up to her, smiled, and said, "Good morning. You've finally come to your senses. And I've always said nature heals everything." She had never felt this good in the last 4 years of her illness. There was no pain, and everything cleared up in her eyes. She even felt that she could breathe deeply. "My husband brought me here because he wanted to leave me. The doctors refused me, and then my husband. I thought I was going to die here alone," Stacy admitted a bit haphazardly. "You won't die. Now you definitely won't die since the drugs help. I've been taking care of you for 2 months. I kept thinking that you wouldn't pull through, but you clung to life as best you could. That's it. Now you won't fall into such oblivion. You'll see. You'll be back on your feet in a couple of weeks. Just don't be afraid. I have a dog, and he slept with you all the time here at the foot of the bed. You may not remember him, but he's kind and good. His name is Dick. He stayed with you when I went to the forest," the man said with a smile. "Your husband is a scumbag. Marriages are made in heaven. God has sent you this test." "Excuse me, but why do you live in the forest?" suddenly asked Stacy, who decided to change the subject. "Me? I became a beggar, fired from work, and the bank took the house. I had to beg in the city, and there I met Dick. And then he went into the woods and led me to this house. I have established relationships with local villagers. I help them with household chores for groceries. That's how I got settled, and I've been living here for 2 years. I would be glad to return to society, but I have neither money nor the opportunity," the man said with a sad smile. They talked until the morning. So week after week went by, and along with gratitude, love blossomed in Stacy's soul. They understood each other without a word. Stacy had never felt so happy, but one day when she was completely stronger, she decided to leave. He let her go, even though he didn't believe she would ever come back. Stacy was too beautiful for him, too well off to spend the rest of her life with a beggar somewhere in the deep woods. He took her to the village, where they took her to the city. Stacy went to her lawyer first, and a real nightmare began. It turned out that her husband had almost registered her as deceased, and there were only a few days left before the verdict of the court was announced. But Stacy made huge efforts to stop it and fought for more than one day. The court's decision was overturned, then Stacy withdrew all the money from her account and bought a good house in a small town with good infrastructure nearby. She repurchased her car that her husband had pawned, but she never showed her face to him. Stacy immediately got behind the wheel and drove to that very remote forest to that house. When the man who had healed her, whose name was Jack, came out, he was happy to see his beloved, who had disappeared for 2.5 weeks. "Get ready, I bought us a house, and bring Dick. There's a big yard there. And don't, Jack, just don't be embarrassed, you saved my life. And I'll give us a new home," she said triumphantly, hugging him. By the evening, they were in a new, modern cottage, enjoying every minute spent together. Stacy still did not believe that she had not only survived there in the deep forest, but also met her happiness. When the lawsuit came to Brian in court, he could not believe his eyes. It's been 6 months since he took his wife to die in the woods. He didn't even realize what was going on right away. He appeared in court and was stunned to see a healthy, beautiful wife next to a large, handsome man who hugged her like a hefty bear. And against his background, Brian seemed like a puny reed. The divorce thundered for Brian like a bolt from the blue. He looked at the court order and did not believe that he remained a beggar. His wife's account, his wife's apartment, even the old country house belonged to his wife, and he was left without a job, without an education, absolutely unfit for independent life. Naturally, Jody left him a long time ago, having found a more satisfying place. He rushed from his place to his wife to beg for forgiveness, but a hefty man overshadowed the fragile Stacy. Brian did not dare to act, and he retreated, seeing off the beautiful couple. It was all over. Brian was so happy when he finally left his wife to die in the woods. He was so happy having fun with his young and beautiful mistress. He thanked fate every day for such a wonderful plan. And now what? Now he would have to go back to his mother and live with her until he got his life back on track. Brian soberly assessed the situation and understood that he would not be able to get settled and would rely on his mother. It was a late, warm summer evening. Stacy was sitting on a wide bench in the garden, her head resting on Jack's shoulder. He was hugging her, holding her close, and Stacy felt sure she had never been so happy. Stacy looked at her future husband and thanked him for saving her life. If it weren't for him, she would have died there in the woods. He looked at her and thanked her for her love, for the house, for a new job, and for happiness. If it weren't for her, he would have spent years alone in the forest. It was as if they were sent to each other by fate. The lovers were sitting in the garden, inhaling the scent of herbs after the rain. They just enjoyed each other and were happy that they could be together.
The bright-eyed little girl ran along the shore. Her mother died in childbirth, and her father was responsible for her upbringing. The tall, lean man was hard on the girl. They lived in the old den. The wooden hut somehow held the heat from each crack that blew cold sea air. The man worked as a guard on the lighthouse. His task was to turn on the lantern for lost ships. She saved people's lives from the seamouth. The girl grew up on her own. Mary did not keep her company telling her stories. She was like a wild reed craving companionship. Her father restricted her from civilization. There was nothing in the house but a wooden table, a couple of chairs, and a bed. Once a week, Mike, her father's name, went shopping. Their diet consisted of black bread, macaroni, and some croup. They were supplied with fish by the sea. These days, the baby was left on the island all alone. "Oh, that's beautiful." She opened the electric board, said the little rascal. Dad was gone. He was late. Mary thought Dad was lost at sea and maybe he needed help. "For Dad to find me, I need to turn on the lantern on the lighthouse. He will see and will come home." Thin baby hands reached into thick electrical wires. She was saving her dad. Before she could get the cable, there was a bang, and many tiny sparks shone across her face. "Ow, it hurts so much." Trying to cover her face with her hands, she fell on the cold, damp ground. A couple of hours later, her father moored to the shore. He didn't see the blonde girl running. He suspected something was wrong. The father's heart was popping out of his chest. Out of breath, the father's heart was popping out of his chest. Out of breath, he ran to the house, but no one was there. After looking through all the daughter's favorite places, he did not find her. There was only one place, the lighthouse. The lighthouse door was open. "Dad, where are you?" Mary's voice was barely heard. "Mary, my daughter, what happened?" the lighthouse keeper shouted. The little girl was lying there with no sign of life. Massive tears were coming out of her eyes. Her father raised his daughter with shaking hands. His daughter had an accident. Mike dragged her outside. Dad, why is it so dark? Father looked at his only daughter with horror. The light was shining in the yard. His lips trembled. So now is the night. The desperate father answered, choking in his tears. She went blind. All life was divided, before and after. Now she had to learn to live in a new way. It had to be a clean slate. He wondered how to explain to poor Mary that she would never see sunlight. How did the seasons change? The 7-year-old girl continued to lie in the man's hands. The father fell to his knees. Pressing his daughter, he wept with all his might. God, why are you punishing me like this? He turned to the sky. You took my wife, and now you want to deprive my daughter of me? Poor Mike. With the last strength in his fist, he carried his daughter into the house. Honey, now we have to learn to live in a new way. Tears continued to flow from Mary's eyes. Then she understood the situation. Her childhood world was immersed in eternal darkness. Lying there for a couple of days, she tried to get up. Her white feet stood on a cold wooden floor. She fell a couple of steps. Fear, mistrust, and confusion stopped her. It was a cold, harsh winter. The girl was growing up. Her father tried to breathe life into Mary, but she felt nothing. Her eyes were always cold. She tried to see something, closed her eye, and she squinted all the time, but the result was not there. Having reached the age of 18, the father decided to put his daughter in a specialized boarding school. There were children with various defects, as their parents called them. Mary cried and did not want to let go of her father. After all, she had no mother. She was afraid of losing the one person she knew. The teachers at school were strict. The children were very violent. These children never saw the faces of their natural parents. Their parents had long since abandoned them. They had written them out of their lives. They had not loved Mary since the first day. She was too bright. She was always fighting for justice, defending her point of view. She was trying to survive in a violent environment. Her only consolation was her friend Emma. The girls quickly hit it off. Emma saw but could not hear. She was her eyes. The girls spent all their time together. Emma talked about everything around them, and Mary painted in her imagination the bright world in which she lived. It did not last long. Emma was soon adopted. Mary felt abandoned and forgotten. Mike visited his daughter very rarely. He tried to find a good job and ran to the doctors hoping that at least someone could help him regain his daughter's sight. Everyone had their hands up and refused him. She spent 10 years in this horrible place. Mike took her home after graduating. The lighthouse has been recognized as a local attraction for all these years of absence. Crowds of tourists began to visit the island. But even this did not save the financial situation of the family. It is worth noting that she acquired a unique ability with the loss of vision. She sang very beautifully. She sang songs every time she walked in the open air. She remembered and knew every hillock. Twisting her memories from childhood, she was afraid to forget the brightest moments. As she walked, she hummed her new song. Her eyes were full of tears. She constantly cried as she sang. On that day, another group of visitors arrived on the island. The guide Lively kept the historical story about the old lighthouse. Tourists listened to him very carefully. Among them were 2 guys. These were young sailors who had just returned from a long voyage. JC, the blonde-haired guy, was different from his friend. JC's friend was too frivolous. At that moment, she was sitting on the hill. The wind was playing in her long, thick hair. Her gaze was drawn further away, trying to see something. JC fell in love with Mary at first sight. He didn't know the girl was blind. He snuck up and tried to capture her on his camera. Hearing the camera click, the girl hurried away. She was avoiding people. But the persistent young man found the right words to win the young lady over to him. Looking into her eyes, he saw the emptiness and despair. Mary looked at his face with her hands. Her long fingers glided over his face. She tried not to miss the features of his face. As she spent her evenings talking, she fell in love with the boy. No one cared or cared more about her than would live without him. His health deteriorated. He had terminal cancer. A terrible cough with blood kept torturing him. Frequent fainting spells prevented his daughter from having a happy life. He left his little girl in the hands of a violent world. Learning that Mary could regain her sight with expensive surgery, JC went to his beloved father. Her father listened to him and said he could not collect such money, and there was no one to lend. He did not have such an amount. JC wanted Mary to start seeing him. JC's crime was the only way to get Mary's sight back. He committed the robbery and secretly sent all the money to the clinic where the surgery was due. That evening was the last time Mary heard the voice of her loved one. JC was forced to resort to deception. He told her that he needed to go on a long sail. The girl's heart trembled. Everyone she loved so much refused her, but she knew he wouldn't be happy with a blind woman. After the act, the boy surrendered to the local police and was given 5 years in prison as punishment. Mary underwent an operation, after which she regained her sight. Meanwhile, the girl learned that she was pregnant. She would have a son. Her father soon died. Now she was alone in this vast world. She gave birth to a son and did not stop waiting for her lover. All day she walked, looking into the faces. She was looking for him, her boyfriend. It was hard to imagine him. She never saw him, only felt his body. She named her son Robert. She came to live on the island alone with her child. It was difficult for her to feed the child at the same time and provide for her financially. In such a limbo, she could not take care of the child. Robert was restless, constantly crying. There was no help. One day, having gathered her son, Mary went to the nearest grocery store. Leaving her son on the street, she tried to leave in a hurry, but the loud cry of her child stopped her. God, what am I doing? She went back to her son. With the child, she wandered the dark streets all night. There was a real war inside her head. She understood that the child was from her lover, which was the fruit of their true love. It was tough for her to live on. She ran out of money. One day, she decided to take her own life. She stepped up the highway with trembling hands and tears in her eyes, suffocating with tears. The sparkle of the headlights blinded her. One car braked sharply in front of her. The driver got out of the vehicle and began shouting at her. She stood, petrified, her son bursting with tears. The man grabbed her and the child and put them in the car and drove them home. He was shocked to see the state of their home and poverty they were living in. He understood what the girl was running from. He understood why she wanted to kill herself and her child. I'm so tired of living. These problems are constantly weighing on my shoulders. She talked and cried at the same time. Sam, the name of her savior, promised to help her. It was painful for him to watch as a young mother struggled to survive in this vast world. The difficulty was that she had never met her lover. In her memories, there was only a voice and image that she imagined for herself. Maybe there was no such person. The man understood the longer he stayed with her, the more he liked her. Mary was ready to take the courtship of a new guy. But one day, she saw her picture in Sam's folder. It was her very first picture. It was me. She froze. Under a pile of papers, she found a guy who was accused of stealing. After learning about the boy's prison, she hurried to see him. She wanted the truth. She did not expect to see her lover as she walked along a dark, damp-soaked corridor. An iron door opened, and she entered the meeting room. She had to wait a few minutes. and felt like her whole life was flashing before her eyes. The door opened, but she hesitated to turn. A man's trembling voice called out to her, "Mary!" Hearing his voice, she fell unconscious. She came to her senses and said, "It's that voice. It's him. I found you." After talking to JC, she returned home. Sam sat there as if nothing was happening. Then she realized that Sam was deliberately hiding all the information. He decided to take JC's place, but Mary continued to be calm. Her lover had 6 months to wait before he went to prison. Then they could start over and raise the boy. Sam tried his best to extend JC's sentence, and his goal was to get rid of JC forever, but fate told him otherwise. Mary miraculously learned of Sam's treacherous plan. He tried to deceptively marry the girl, to take away the hut that was in the lighthouse. 3 months had passed. JC was out of prison. During that time, Mary lived in a hut near the lighthouse. Another sleepless night passed. One morning, her son woke up and ran to pick up the seashells after the storm. "Mom," said the child's voice. The woman shuddered. Sam stood on the shore and looked at them with a smile. Mary screamed and ran to kiss her lover. Within a week, they found the right words and explained to Robert that they now had a fully fledged family. "Was your dad?" She said nothing with tears in her eyes. But there was one unfinished business. It was Sam. Mary told about the schemes of the cunning man. JC decided to seek help from the relevant authorities. When he arrived there, he met a friend with whom he went on the same excursion where he saw Mary and lost his mind a few years ago. His friend listened to his story. He promised to help. Soon Sam's frauds were exposed, and the man was imprisoned. The happy family decided to sell all the property and leave the island. With the money they received, they bought a house where they raised their children in perfect harmony.